Hello everyone! Welcome to this second Autism Chat video. So for those who don't know, I am on the autism spectrum. I was non-verbal up until the age of 5. I was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome at age 8. And now, as an adult in my 30s, I am what's labeled as high-functioning autistic. I decided to do some Q&A style videos where people send me questions and I answer them while playing video games, which is my comfort zone. So we've got a few questions that people have sent in already, and I'll be going through those on this video. If there's a question that you'd like to ask me for a future video, you can leave your questions in the comment section below, or email me at my business address, which is bencollier@whiterosewriters.com. And just make it clear that it's a question for the autism videos, and then I'll know to save the question for then. I'm open to pretty much any kind of question. Most things about me are going to relate to autism in some way, just because it affects so much of my life. Just keep in mind that I want to keep these videos kid-friendly, so keep the questions also kid-friendly. So with the intro out of the way, let's get to some questions. One here from Kirsty Shanks, who asks, do you feel that being on the spectrum impacts your writing? If so, what are some positives and negatives regarding that? Alright, so impact, yes, and pretty sure I can think of some positives and negatives. And the first two that come to mind are actually connected, like the same thing, which is the tendency to hyper-focus on details that I find interesting, and that not necessarily are of that much interest to other people. When it comes to detailed world building, as I do in fantasy writing, that is, or can be, a positive or a negative depending on how you harness it. Well, I don't need more iron. What the heck am I doing? One thing I know about readers of fantasy is it is important for them to know that you, as the writer, have put enough thought into this world, that the world is capable of existing on its own without your help. Or at least that's how I would word it. And that requires a lot of fine detail. The kind of details that you wouldn't bother to put in if you're trying to just spit something out quickly. Readers like to be immersed in your world, and so they want to know that every detail has been taken care of by you. At the same time, though, readers don't necessarily want to have to spend hours on end reading about a particular character's shopping schedule. They don't want to know the name of every single person in your town. Only the characters who actually matter. It's nice to know that everybody has a name, but they don't want to know everybody's name. One case in point from my earlier writings is that I am a big fight choreography buff, and so I want to choreograph and write out in detail every single move that occurs during a fight. And that would be okay on film, but not in writing. Not when being read. And so I've had to learn to rein that in by, instead of describing every move in detail, I find ways of describing in general the overall feel and flow and pacing of a fight, with descriptions to certain visualizations and certain sound effects that you would be hearing during a particular kind of battle. And painting a general picture with words, instead of painting a picture with words as opposed to painting a textbook with words. That's not what people want to read. Not when reading fantasy, at least. Another one from Kirsty Shanks. Are there a lot of misconceptions you encounter when people find out you're on the autism spectrum? Or are people generally aware and understanding? I think people tend to just not let me know what their conceptions are. Except for when people praise me for being articulate. I know that's something that's not considered common, or at least it's not a common perception of autism. And that's where the qualifier of high functioning comes in. But in general, socializing, I think I find that people are mostly understanding it, because once they find out that I'm on the autism spectrum, usually they've already been talking to me for a while, and so one of the big assumptions about that is already gone. Because they see how I talk, and it's not how they're used to hearing people on the spectrum talk. Ow. So, once that cat is out of the bag, so to speak, I think people are automatically pretty open to whatever other revelations may come about. I do, however, think that I encounter some misconceptions with people who I've only met online or through text, because finding out that I'm on the autism spectrum and having not met me in person, I think that what's coming up is that a lot of people expect me to be like the good doctor, which is one of a number of reasons why I don't like that show. Because I will say this, and it's been said, if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. We are all different. We have different quirks. We have some similarities, but we are not all one and the same. So I don't know if there actually does exist anyone on the spectrum who is at all like the good doctor and how he portrays autism, but I have met many people on the spectrum at different levels of severity, and I can say, at least as far as my own experience, that I have never met anybody who talks like him. We talk slowly, in the sense that we take more time to think about what we're going to say before we say it. And then we talk at a normal speed. Or we talk in very simple words. Please, thank you, hello, goodbye. If that's all we can manage. Or we just don't say anything. But what I have never encountered before is someone on the spectrum who says every word slowly, as if learning the word as they say it. I feel like that's the actor's generalization of what a mental disability sounds like to him, and not an accurate reflection of autism based on any of the individuals on the spectrum that I personally have met. Now, if anyone out there on the spectrum does talk like that, or knows someone who talks like that, then by all means let me know. Like, put it in the comments, because then I'll learn something. And I would be thankful for that. Thank you. But based on my experience so far, that is certainly something that I would label as a misconception. Yeah. Are you friendly?
You there, please. You have to help me. I was attacked by a vampire. Do you have a
Well, that sounds like a you
that
problem.
can cure this before I turn?
Question from my mother. Did reality feed into your imagination, or did your imagination feed into your reality? I guess I would say both, to a degree. I certainly use aspects of reality in my writing, because, I mean, it's write what you know, right? Like, and the most impactful writing, I think, tends to come from personal experience, because it tends to be the most real and the most raw, and the readers feel that. Speaking from my own experience, I think when I wrote Singularity, that was probably the best example of writing out of personal pain, because the story is very much about feeling lost and confused, wondering what's going on, and to an extent questioning reality, and feeling isolated. And those were all feelings that I legitimately had to a very strong degree. I didn't want to write it when I did, really. But I had already made the goal of I was going to publish one book a year, and of the projects that were on my mind that I could do, it was the only one that I felt I could start from scratch and have finished, edited, and published by the end of that year. I got through the story quickly because I was feeling it. But it was more painful to write when I did, because of how closely I was feeling certain things. As for an example of my imagination feeding into my reality, the best example I can think of is in Chronomancer, or rather the experience of writing Chronomancer and the effect that that had on me. Specifically when it came to writing the character of Zira. Because Zira was one of those characters whose entire concept was so easily defined in my mind that she would practically write herself. Because her core concept for me was a single sentence. It was quintessential High Elven princess. And that means very different things to different people. And for a lot of people, that's far too general of a description. But not for me. For me, it means something very specific because of the exposure that I've had to different kinds of elven princesses throughout my life and my childhood, watching various movies, TV shows, playing various games. But the reason that I say that fed into my reality is because Zira has a very miraculously optimistic way of looking at things. Even when she herself acknowledges that things are very dark. Like, one of the things that I enjoyed about the process of writing that story in general was that there is a mixture of characters. Like, that group had so many different perspectives. Each character had their own way of looking at things, and each one was valuable. Nobody was put down for looking at things differently than anybody else did. And the most dominant voice was, I think, the more practical one. But even when, like, everybody in the group agreed that the situation that they're in is pretty bad. Like, things are quite dark right now. Zira just had a way of putting an optimistic spin on things. She had this perspective on things where no matter how dark things got, darkness did not have the final say. And there were so many times when I was writing a scene, because I have to get into each character's head in order to write them well. And so often, I would come to like what she had to say on the subject, and I'd come away from it thinking, that's a great way of looking at things. I also should look at things that way. And so, yeah, I feel like writing Zira made me a better person. And that's something that I'm thankful to her for. Despite being a fictional character. Questions that my mother gets asked a lot. How did Ben become a writer? What inspired him to become a writer? What spurred him on to learn how to write novels? I feel like most of that is the same question. The how, like, if it's a question of, like, how I got published the first time, my first publication was a short novel called The Kingdom, and it was co-published with Word Alive Press. And I co-published 2 other books with them as well. I published the follow-up to The Kingdom called Crimson Dawn with Word Alive Press, and my autobiography titled My Life As Is. Every other book I've published apart from them has been self-published through Create Space / Kindle Direct Publishing. Because Create Space became Kindle Direct Publishing. And as far as where I'm at right now as a writer, self-publishing is my preferred way to do it, because I have more control over pricing and formatting and the time frame in which I want things to get done. When I only have mainly myself to think about. And I can find my own editors and my own cover artists. I managed to do the formatting myself, which isn't too hard to believe. And as long as I can cover those things, I feel like self-publishing works. But starting out, co-publishing with Word Alive Press was a good experience for me because it was basically how I got my feet wet and how I learned a lot of the ropes. Like, I learned so much about editing, about writing in general, from my editor, Evan Braun, from Word Alive Press. In fact, I specifically requested him for my 2 other projects that I did through Word Alive Press when I went back to do those 2 projects. I was very happy with his work. And he had the patience for me, so like that's a bonus. Because people have not told me this specifically, I just know from trying to have an outside objective perspective on myself that I can be difficult to work with. I, on occasion, have very specific zones within I want to work, and I do not like to go outside of those zones. As for what inspired me, I believe the most direct answer to that is J.R.R. Tolkien, in the fact that I saw the Lord of the Rings films. I actually grew up with the Hobbit cartoon. That was my favorite cartoon as a child. The Two Towers became my favorite movie of all time, and still is to this day. And basically the discovery that all of this originated from novels, and I was like, well, how did that happen? Like, I want to figure out what that is. What is this process for creating this world? I want to be able to do that kind of thing. It was a transition for me, though, because initially, like, I was not much of a reader as a child, but I was into films and video games. And what I would do when daydreaming is I would write stories for films and for video games, and sometimes TV shows, but not as much. And I discovered that the common denominator amongst all of this was the desire for storytelling. Because frankly, some of these stories that I was coming up with for these video game ideas, they were far more complex than the actual games. Like, I was coming up with details about these worlds and character arcs. And once I learned about how J.R.R. Tolkien initially brought his worlds to life, I was like, I want to learn how to do that. And it was, I think, very shortly after watching the first Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings film that I started writing my first novel. Not a novel that's actually been published yet. It's something that's still on the shelf. But it was my first experience writing a novel. Now, I want to further answer this question I got last time from Michelle and Delisle. They said, my niece was diagnosed with autism. I would love to know where to look for answers, to learn more about it, to learn on how I may support her best. Make sure she's feeling loved and not out of place. Is there any books or websites that are reliable that I may learn more about it? Or is there any suggestions you can make that might help me? And if you go back and watch my first Autism Chat video, I have already covered part of that, but I also kept a part out from the full answer because I do happen to have this. Make sure it's perfectly centered there. My video is a little bit delayed. And this, if you might recognize the name there, because she did ask about books, and this was a book that I wrote. This is my autobiography, My Life As Is, an inside look at autism and Asperger's syndrome. And within this book, I spoke a lot about my experiences growing up on the spectrum. I talk about my experience at different levels of the spectrum because, as I mentioned, I was nonverbal up until the age of 5. Then Asperger's syndrome, now labeled as high-functioning autism. And I discussed so many aspects of my life in this book. And I tried to observe myself objectively when I'm capable of doing that. I believe digital copies of this are still available through Amazon. Physical copies can be purchased through Chapters in Indigo. And also you might recognize this guy. You might recognize that little face there. The guy with the quite long hair and the awesome looking hat and the beautiful smile there. Smile for the camera. I am smiling. So there is that there as well. I will include some links in the description below. And yeah, that is a clearly shameless plug, which is why I didn't want to do it in the first video, but since this is the second video, I don't mind doing a shameless plug. You can see this was during one of my long hair phases, and as you can maybe tell, I'm in one of my long hair phases again. This is the third time now that I've been growing my hair out for the purpose of donating it at some point, which started at the beginning of the pandemic, because I didn't want to go to a hairdresser anyway at the time. I just want to see how goth I look. Ooh. Yeah. I'm pretty sure this is the longest it's ever been. I've been growing it so long that I'm slowly getting used to it. By the time this video airs, I might have already donated it. I'm not sure. But we are now, at time of recording, starting to get close to summer, so having this much hair is starting to be a sweat inducer. So, and I'm pretty sure it's long enough for donating, so should try and get on that soon. Got a question from Cortando NS1, who asks, do you have a favorite Nintendo game? Of the games specifically put out by Nintendo, the data that I look at for deciding my favorite video game out of a particular list is I look at how much time has been spent enjoying the game, not just how long I've played it. Because, let's be honest, sometimes you spend way more time than you want to on a game that is just really, really frustrating. And sometimes you have a lot of fun, but like only for a couple hours or something, and then it gets boring. But if I look at specifically the combination of amount of time spent and how much fun I had while spending all that time, it's a weird answer, but I think it ends up being Smash Brothers Brawl, actually, for the Wii, the first Wii system. A weird answer because by now Smash Brothers Ultimate has been out for like a couple of years, I think. And that is the better game in basically every regard, as far as like, what people would normally be looking at, like the number of characters. Ultimate has every character. Crazy number of stages, actually too many stages. For my liking, it's too much to think about. More modes and contexts for play, and the ability to have up to 8 people on screen at once, which I love. I'm all about that kind of crazy, chaotic combat. But there is just something about Ultimate compared to Brawl that, I don't know, I find that when I'm actually playing it, I don't have as much fun as I do playing Brawl. I think it's something to do with how the AI behaves, because both fighting and watching the AI on higher difficulties is just not as fun. The mechanics for how the AI works, I do think part of it though, one thing that Brawl had that none of the other games in this series had as good of a version of was the story mode, where you went through different kinds of locations and you were actually doing platforming levels combined with combat while playing as characters of your choice. Although you are limited as far as which characters you can use at first, but the characters start to like come together and then you get access to more and more. Because what do they call it? The World of Light in Ultimate, which is just navigate this map and have a fight at a time, and then do some more navigating of the map. I find that boring. I want to be able to click on a thing on the map and then get several quick fights one after another without having to do any more navigating or one huge fight. You know, because I had a similar problem in Soul Calibur 6 with their story mode that they made for custom characters. It wasn't necessarily a bad idea, it's just they ask you to do too much navigation before giving you a fight where you just fight a guy and then it's over. A question from Inescalar. What characteristic of autism do you like / enjoy / find positive? Characteristic. What I keep coming back to is the thing about myself that I have the most positive opinion of, and that I at least partially attribute to autism, is my imagination. I'm sure to some degree that would very much still be there if autism wasn't a factor. Because as I've said elsewhere, I think that without autism I would still be me. I do think that my capacity for imagination has been enhanced. Because of, as I said before, the capacity to hyper-focus on things. Because that in particular is not a quality I would have as much without autism, I don't think. And it's certainly something that I enjoy. Yeah. And that is going to do it for this video. Thank you guys for watching. Thank you to everyone who sent in questions. Again, if you have questions that you'd like me to answer in a future video, leave a comment below, or you can send me an email at bencollier@whiterosewriters.com, and I may answer your question in a future video. Until next time, stay safe out there. I'll see you later.